am I right that about 3 in 4 people here are from the TEDxUHasseltSalon? Is that correct? Can I hear you? Yeah. Yeah? So for those of you from the soft sciences, that's about 70%. For those of you from the exact sciences, stay calm, 70% is a good enough estimation. For the remaining 25% from the real world, the people that work and pay taxes, still bear with me while I get these beautiful young students on board on the topic of this evening with 2 questions. First question, assume I tell you there is a degree you can take. It's going to take a few years, it's hard work, and by the time you have the degree, no one would like to hire you. Who would take that degree? I've seen a few hesitating hands. We need to talk during the break. The rest of you, that's a very smart choice. In the real world, people work for a few years very hard to make products and services that no one wants to buy. Okay? Question number 2. Assume I tell you, you can get in forehand the questions for the exam. The only thing you have to do is walk up to the professor and say, "Dear professor, I really would appreciate to have the questions for the exam so I can study really hard to give you good answers to those questions." And I'm being fair, I'm not asking for the answers, I'm just asking for the questions. And he would say yes. Who would dare to do that? Let me see some hands. That's very smart. Now I have good news and bad news. The bad news, this was purely hypothetical. This is not going to happen in your student life. That's the bad news. The good news, in the real life, you can do that. And let me explain myself. In the real life, when you work a few years very hard to make a product or a service, the only one that would judge you and score you is the customer. Either he really likes your product and is so excited he's prepared to buy it, or he doesn't. And in real life, in the real world, you can actually visit that customer in forehand and discover his problems. You know, "Dear customer, what are you struggling with? What problems would you like me to solve?" You can come with ideas and show him those ideas and tell, what do you think about that idea? Is it good? Is this the product you think you would like to buy? Would you like me to change it? Can you afford it? You can ask all these questions in forehand so that by the time you have your product, after a few years of hard work, the customers would actually like it and buy it because you tested it with them in forehand. And this is the principle of lean innovation. Now, there are a few basic concepts that I want to explain on lean innovation, which will be part of the rest of the presentation. They're not difficult. First concept, problem-solution fit. Do I have a problem that's important enough, and there are enough people that actually would be prepared to pay for a solution for the problem? Question number 1. Question number 2, product-market fit. The product I have in mind, is that the product that the market would like to buy? Is it a fit for the market? Does it have the functionality they need? Is it within a price range that they can afford? And you need to have, obviously, a yes on both questions. That's the first principle. Second principle, customer discovery and customer validation. Customer discovery is basically going to your customer and understanding his world, understanding his pains, his gains, and the job that he's trying to get done, right? Customer validation is going to the customer and validating specific concept with that customer. For example, product IDs, and see how he likes them, the feedback he has, and further develop your ID. And the methodology to do that is called the validated learning loop, right? And basically, with the validated learning loop, you have 3 steps. You build, you measure, and you learn. You build a prototype or a prototype, you take it to the customer, you measure the reaction, you learn from the reaction, you adapt your prototype, you take it again, learn, build, measure, learn. You do that until you get to a product that is good enough, fitting enough for what the customer needs, and that you can bring it to the market. Now, I know it all sounds logical, but actually you will see in the real world when you argue to go out there and learn from your customer, there's always going to be someone that will speak about a quote from Mr. Ford. And what did Mr. Ford said? Mr. Ford said, if I would have asked the market what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. You heard it before, right? Now, who was I to argue against Mr. Ford? And to make things worse, Steve Jobs said the same thing. Yeah? So for years I was frustrated by this because I couldn't debate against it. And you know, I followed therapy, that didn't help. I did some soul searching, I found other interesting stuff, but that didn't really help. And then I did some Google searching, and I found an article by Eric Morris. And basically that article was an epiphany, because then it all came together. And this is what I want to share with you in the rest of this talk. What I'm going to do is, I'm going to prove that the market was asking to replace the horse. They were begging to replace the horse. I would debate and show you that Henry Ford was struggling to get the product market fit right. Yeah? And actually he was using lean methodology avant la lettre. So let's go back to about the year 1900. Follow me, 1899. What happened is that in the 30 years before that, between 1870 and 1900, the horse population tripled in those 30 years. And there were about 22 million horses in North America alone. Just imagine the streets, you know, with a traffic jam of horse and carriage. That was the situation. And the flies, and the filth, and the fatalities. Because, you know, the horses, they were nervous. Horses also don't like to be in traffic jams. They do unpredictable things, and actually people died. And they calculated that we're actually going towards an ecological disaster, because at this pace of growth of the horse population, New York would have been submerged under 3 meters, 9 feet of horse manure. Okay? So that was a true calculation based on the reality on the ground. So we were walking towards an ecological disaster. So the market was asking for a replacement of the horse. They were not asking for faster horses. They would be stuck in traffic anyhow, right? And Mr. Ford understood that. And basically, he had a beautiful business case that he could take to his investors. Now, in those days, you couldn't be a venture capitalist because that term didn't exist. You can only be investor. So he went to a few investors and he said, you know, there is this population of, you know, 22 million horses, and they will have to be replaced by the automobile. And he could show them the report, you know, if you don't do that, we're going to be under so many meters of horse manure. And the automotive market at that time was non-existent. It was 0.07% of the market. There were about 3,000 cars sold per year. So he said, you know, let's make a truck company and replace the horses with the truck. Now, to me, it sounded a great idea. Who would invest in that company? I would have. Can I see other hands? Who would have invested? Yeah, courageous young people, and it's a good business case to invest in. And, you know, what happened is within 2 years, they went bust. Within 2 years, they went bust because the trucks they built were not good enough for the market. Yeah? And they were unreliable, they were difficult to repair, and they were expensive. Even though they could prove, they had a total cost of ownership calculation, that it was cheaper to buy a car than hold a horse. It didn't hold. So what did Mr. Ford do? You know, he picked himself up, dusted himself off, and looked for new investors. Now, I don't think that what he said there is, you know, this bankruptcy, actually that's a good thing, I'm failing forward. They didn't know that at that time, the concept of failing forward. But probably what he said was, you know, I really believe that we can come up with a car that, that people would like to buy and that they could afford to buy. Yeah? And he got a second chance, and he opened the Ford company in 1903. And in between 1903 and 1908, the year that the Model T came out, he introduced 9 different models to the market. And in each model, he was testing the market. He was seeing the reaction of the market. He was playing with the pricing. He was playing with the technology. And every time I listened to it, now you need to be aware that 9 models in such a short period of such an innovative technology is really, really fast, right? And he only sold, you know, either a few hundreds or a few thousand. So it was a very, very small volume of product. But every time testing with the market, what was the reaction of the market? So he learned that eventually for a car to be successful, it had to be cheaper than certainly $1,000, around $750. It had to have a high ground clearance because there were no roads. There were mainly muddy roads. So you wanted to be able to drive to the roads. They had to be simple to drive. It was a new thing, automobiles, so people had to learn how to drive the car. And it had to be easy and cheap to repair if you wanted to sell a lot of them. And he really nailed that concept down with the Model T. Now, the other thing they had to do is they had to further lower the price of the Model T, and they had to find a way to produce enough cars to meet the demand. And this is where Ford took the mass production line concept and really fine-tuned it. Yeah? And he didn't invent the mass production line. Yeah? That was done by others. But he refined it, and they used it because it was the only way they could produce so many cars so cheap. So they were solving two problems at the same time, producing a lot of cars and doing it cheap. And this is another lesson you need to remember. Innovation is not a goal by itself. Innovation enforces itself when you cannot solve a problem with the existing way of working, with the existing methodology. That's why the mass production line had to be invented and refined. And then you can see on the table how the sales continued to grow as the price was going down, eventually to less than $300. And by 1924, they sold more than 2 million cars per year. Yeah? 1 in 2 Ford cars, 1 in 2 cars in the world that were sold then was a Model T car. So it was a huge success. So what does it tell us? It tells us that the way to interpret the quote is not don't go out there and listen to the market. You should go out there and listen to the market. What it's telling us is that you should go there and ask the right questions. You don't go to your customer and ask them, what should I make? That's your job to figure that out. But you go to the customer to listen to their problems, to understand what they are struggling with in their everyday life, and now you can find a way to resolve that. And then you can go back again and again to just fine-tune your solution until you get to a good product market fit. That's the way we should interpret that quote by Mr. Ford. Now, for sure, in your future life, in your, once you get in your working life, and you speak about listening to the voice of the customer and going out there, there's gonna be someone that will bring up the quote by Mr. Ford. So I would leave you with one cartoon from my book. And I suggest you handle it in the following way. You let them say what they have to say about the quote, and then you say, horseshit. Now, you don't say it too loud, you just say it loud enough that they can hear it. And here comes the important part. You need to observe them, make sure they understand what you said. Did he say horseshit yet? He said horseshit. But not too long. You need to wait before they feel insulted, or that they burst out on you. So the right moment you say, horseshit was the problem that Mr. Ford was solving. And then you guys can tell this story. Thank you very much.